England and France have shared a well-known rivalry since the early Middle Ages, a rivalry that can be traced back to 1066, when the Duke of Normandy, William the Conqueror, did what he did best. He conquered England. From that moment on, the destinies of these two nations were intertwined, bound by blood, land, and ambition. But this was no ordinary rivalry. By the 14th century, the English and French crowns were connected by complex familial ties and conflicting claims. It all began with the death of Charles IV of France in 1328, the last king of the Capetian dynasty. Charles died without a male heir, leaving the French throne without a clear successor. According to the principles of feudal law, the crown should pass to the closest male relative. However, there was a problem. His closest male relative was a young Edward III, officially King of England, who was Charles IV's nephew through his mother, Isabella of France. The French nobility, however, would never accept an English king. They invoked an old law, the Salic law, which barred inheritance of the throne through the female line, and instead chose Philip VI, a cousin of Charles IV, to be the new king. In the years leading up to the war, tensions between Edward III and Philip VI continued to grow. At the heart of the conflict was the Duchy of Aquitaine, a vast and wealthy territory in southwestern France that had long been under English control. According to feudal tradition, Edward III, as Duke of Aquitaine, was technically a vassal to the French king, which meant he was expected to swear allegiance to Philip VI. However, Edward III, who had just recently solidified his power in England after a turbulent regency, was reluctant to do so. His refusal to pay homage to the French monarch was seen as a direct challenge to the French king's authority. In response, Philip VI seized Aquitaine and other English-held territories in France, a move that directly threatened England's economic interests and its king's honor. For Edward III, this was the final insult. Not only had he been denied his rightful claim to the French throne, but now he was being stripped of his ancestral lands. The war begun. The early years of the war, which would last 116 years, saw a series of stunning English victories, largely due to their effective use of the longbow. In 1340, the English fleet triumphed at the Battle of Sluys, securing control of the Channel and cutting off French sea power. Normandy, in particular, would be under immense English pressure for the coming years. Another crucial factor was Flanders, England's most vital ally on the continent. Flanders was highly dependent on English wool, a fact Edward III was keenly aware of. The money received from the export of wool would be a deciding factor in the war's early years, as England used these funds to secure military aid on the continent, mostly from German and Dutch states. Financial troubles would later become a significant problem for the island. In 1346, Edward III launched a major campaign into northern France, culminating in the Battle of Crécy. At Crécy, the English army, though outnumbered, decimated the French forces with a withering barrage of arrows. The French knights, charging in disorganized waves, were cut down in droves. This battle marked a turning point, showcasing the effectiveness of the longbow and signaling the decline of the feudal knight on the battlefield, a shift that would later be echoed at Agincourt. Just as the war seemed to favor England, Europe was struck by a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions, the Black Death. The plague ravaged the continent from 1347 to 1351, decimating populations and halting military campaigns. Both England and France were forced to pause their conflict, leading to what became known as the Long Truce. From 1/3 to half of Europe's population perished during the plague. As the Black Death waned, the war resumed, albeit on a smaller scale due to the reduced armies. In 1356, Edward, the Black Prince, son of Edward III, led a daring raid into the heart of France. This campaign culminated in the Battle of Poitiers, another crushing English victory. The French army was shattered, and King John II, successor to Philip of Valois, was captured. At this point, France was in a state of civil war. The Treaty of Bretigny, signed in 1360, temporarily ended hostilities. Under its terms, England gained extensive territories in France, and Edward renounced his claim to the French throne, at least for the time being. It is noteworthy that England was never able to exploit its victories to ultimately defeat France. Despite its successes, England could not match France's superior manpower and could not afford the funds required for prolonged campaigns. In the 1370s, under the leadership of King Charles V, France began to recover. Charles adopted a new strategy, avoiding pitched battles and focusing on attrition, fortifications, and reclaiming territory through guerrilla tactics. This strategy began to pay off. The English, overstretched and unable to hold their vast territories, were gradually pushed back. By 1380, much of the land gained at Bretigny had been retaken by the French. However, the war dragged on, with neither side able to deliver a decisive blow. Long after the death of Edward III, France was torn apart by a civil war between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, two powerful factions vying for control. Meanwhile, King Charles VI of France, known as the Mad, suffered from severe bouts of insanity. With France vulnerable, there was an opportunity for England to strike once more. In 1415, the newly crowned King Henry V of England sought to revive his country's fortunes by renewing the claim to the French throne. Henry was determined to assert his claim. In August 1415, he launched an invasion, landing in Normandy with an army of around 12,000 men. After besieging and capturing the port of Harfleur, Henry's forces were weakened by disease and dwindling supplies. On October 25, 1415, as Henry's army approached Agincourt, they found themselves facing a much larger French force. The odds seemed insurmountable. Outnumbered, fatigued, and bogged down by rain-soaked terrain, the English appeared destined for defeat. But Henry had other plans. Henry positioned his longbowmen behind sharpened stakes, forcing the French to charge across a narrow, muddy field. The result was catastrophic for the French. Their heavily armored knights, bogged down in the mud, became easy targets for the English archers. The French assault collapsed into chaos, and what began as a battle quickly turned into a massacre. The Battle of Agincourt was a decisive victory for Henry. His smaller force had shattered the flower of French nobility, killing or capturing thousands, including many of France's most prominent knights. This victory secured Henry's position as one of England's greatest military leaders and marked the height of English power in the 100 Years' War. Yet, the war was far from over.